Hello, this is Richard Long with the Learning First Alliance. Today, we have a really exciting introduction of a new translation adaptation of an important work, creating safe, equitable, engaging schools. This is an incredibly important subject. We have several of the editors of that work here today, plus many of the presenters or writers who are Spanish-speaking professionals working in the education community. Angela Herrera of AIR is here to provide us with an introduction. But before we begin, let me remind you that the chat is open for all, and please feel free to put questions, comments, and engage in a dialogue while this is ongoing. Angela?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to provide this opening in Spanish since we're doing this bilingually. Bienvenidos al lanzamiento del libro Creando Escuelas Seguras, Equitativas y que involucran a todos. Es la adaptación al libro en español. En inglés se llama Creating Safe, Equitable, and Engaging Schools. Y en un minuto, David Osher, uno de los autores del libro, va a hablar sobre el propósito del libro y cómo los líderes escolares pueden usar el libro para crear comunidades que apoyan las necesidades sociales, emocionales y académicas de todos los estudiantes. En este evento también contamos con la participación de la doctora Laura Hernández, investigadora principal del Learning Policy Institute, y Ray Saldaña es el presidente y director general de Communities and Schools. Yo soy Angelica Herrera y soy una investigadora principal de American Institutes for Research, o por sus siglas en inglés AIR. También soy una de las líderes del grupo de empleados que se llama VIVA. VIVA apoya el desarrollo de los empleados en AIR que somos hispanos, latinos o chicanos, y brinde un espacio profesional y colegial para tener conversaciones sobre la diversidad y cómo podemos contribuir a la misión de AIR. Y si no conocen AIR, AIR es una organización no partidista sin fines de lucro que realiza investigaciones y brinda asistencia técnica para resolver algunos de los desafíos más urgentes en la educación. También sabemos que la equidad comienza con sistemas que funcionan para todos y estamos comprometidos a seguir la evidencia y encontrar prácticas efectivas que apoyan al aprendizaje de todos los niños. Y una de esas prácticas es proveer presentaciones, materiales y libros en español. Más de 10% de los estudiantes en los Estados Unidos son multilingües o hablan más de un idioma en sus casas. Y más de 75% de esos estudiantes hablan el español en su casa. Y David y los autores desean que esta adaptación de su libro sea útil para todos esos estudiantes y educadores que son fluentes en el español. Y ahora lo paso a David.
Thank you, Angelica. I want to start with something that people tell us can't happen. Schools can support the thriving of all students and the robust learning of all students. We know that from science. We know that from practice. We also know that there are no silver bullets. But what there are some golden principles of practice that we can apply. And that includes what we can do, as well as what are the things we shouldn't do. I work in an organization, American Institutes for Research, where we're broadcasting from, that is a non-for-profit. I'm being adjusted here, okay. That is deeply committed to equity and the realizing of equity in this country and worldwide, and committed fully as part of its mission to generate good evidence and then to support the use of that evidence. And one of the things that may distinguish us a little is that from other research organizations is that while we have real strong researchers, we also have people who have their boots in practice. And that's why I came to AIR, and I actually insisted that I be able to spend my life both half in research and half in practice. I say that because in 2018, looking at where our country was, we felt that it was really important to build on what we were learning about the science of learning and development, and also to share lessons that we have been seeing across the country in places that really were trying to embody good, scientifically based, culturally responsive practices in ways that could realize a difference. And we wanted to make that accessible. While that knowledge was important in 2018, it didn't become dated now. If anything, it became much more important now, because a key element of that knowledge is based on the understanding that there is an inextricable link between how people feel and how people act and how people learn. Those are not separate things. One is not more important than the other. They come together in our brain. They come together in our body. They come together as we learn. And now, while each of us learns individually, there is a uniqueness to each of us. We also learn with and from each other. And what we need is the support of each other. Dr. James Comer of Yale University said a long time ago, relationships are to schools and learning what real estate is, what location is to real estate. Relationship, but it's supportive relationship. It's culturally responsive relationship. And it's the capacity to have and sustain those relationships. And that book was important in 2018. That knowledge, because of COVID, is even more important right now, because we know how needy we all are, our students, their families, their teachers, and how we have to nourish each other and support each other and to build our capacity to care and learn. I have to interrupt myself because I'm the host, so I have to keep on admitting people, which is nice. I'm a friendly guy. That when we wrote this book, while we knew it might be read individually, we wanted it to be read by all members of the school community. Because if we're really going to change schools, it has to involve young people, it has to involve families, it has to involve community members, and it has to involve everybody who is an educator in the school, paraprofessionals, professionals, teachers, and administrators. And while we wrote 20 chapters that were accessible and really made that point, those chapters were not fully accessible to the over 41 million people in our nation who live in households where Spanish is spoken. Now, many of them can read English, some can't, but there's a difference between reading something and reading something that is very, very meaningful to you, and reading something that you can share with your peers and your family, and reading something that you can't. And AIR's work has always been about robust knowledge, robust equity, robust learning, not just surface learning. And what we need is robust translation in order to enable people not only to read from the same text in English and in Spanish, but to also realize sufficiently deep meaning so that they're able to bring their knowledge, bring their perspectives, bring their concerns together to build and sustain the types of responsive collaborations that are important if we're going to really create those conditions where all our students can thrive and where all our students can learn, and learn in ways that make sense in 2023. Learn in ways that will not be replaced by artificial intelligence. learn in ways so that they can master that artificial intelligence. And I hope this webinar will introduce you to this freely available resource that the Learning First Alliance is making available. And what I want you to know is that through the brilliance of our translator and production team, and it should say the LFA's translator and production team that I had the good fortune of working with, we have done this so both books have the same pagination, so people can also read from the same page and work together from the same page, but bringing their culturally rich funds of knowledge and bringing their different perspectives to that work, because schools, just like people, are dynamic enterprises, and system dynamics work best when people, all the parts are communicating with each other, when people are listening to each other, and when they're responding. And so with that, I now want to pass it on to my colleagues, and I would just want a little coaching person. Pardon?
Laura.
Okay. What we're now going to hear from is three people whom I had the good fortune of, who I know and have learned from in the past, but had the good fortune to ask, and they accepted writing without my guide, without my editing, a text to really talk about the importance of the book. And each one of them will take 5 minutes. I will be facilitating. I will have a question that I might ask during their 5 minutes, maybe after their 5 minutes, and then we'll go beyond. And let me just start with my good colleague, Laura Hernandez from Learning Policy Institute, whom I really have learned so much from. So Laura.
Thank you, David. I am happy to build off of the points you just so eloquently shared about the importance of the original and translated volume. And like you, I do want to begin with some attention to the volume's content. And in addition to its emphasis on relationships and care and how instrumental that is to student learning and development, another one of its clear and central messages is about the varied dimensions of safety and inclusion that support youth learning and development. And this idea of safety, I think it's safe to say that those of us engaging in this work and seeking out this content hold a deep commitment to improving the quality and character of our schools and the experiences they cultivate for young people, but that we're also harboring significant reservations and concerns about the state of our schools. These concerns, of course, stem from decades, if not centuries, of structural inequity that create and sustain poverty, segregation, and other forms of discrimination. But they also stem from more recent trends that we're seeing, like growing threats to physical, social, and psychological safety, like those we see in the upticks in school violence, school shootings, and of course, the identity threats that are being forged against certain communities and groups. But we also hold concerns and reservations about some of the dynamics and responses that we're seeing to what's unfolding in schools as a result of recent dynamics, including the pandemic, overt racialized and identity-based violence, and those of which, of course, include increased school hardening practices or surveillance practices in schools, or an emphasis on identity minimizing pedagogy, or culturally kind of unresponsive approaches to address these challenges. All of which, of course, are approaches that have been empirically shown to reduce engagement, achievement, and a sense of belonging and inclusion in schools. And so I say all of this because in the face of all these dynamics, which are particularly acute at this moment, this edited volume really does the critical work of articulating an alternative, evidence-based, and equity-oriented path forward that elevates what it takes for young people to optimally learn, develop, and thrive. And in doing that, it really underscores that notions of safety and belonging are multifaceted, that it's more than just attention to physical safety, for example, but rather that safety itself is emotional, social, and psychological, and requires attention to care, culturally responsiveness, and social emotional learning, all of which are effective approaches substantiated in this book and in the growing body of research that David invoked, the science of learning and development. And this is something from my own professional experience that informs and guides the research work on whole child school design that I do at the Learning Policy Institute through things like our recently co-created and co-published playbook for called the Design Principles for Schools, and numerous other case studies that we have that provide these kind of rich descriptions of whole child schools in action and the structures and systems that support it. And this edited volume really does the important work again of amplifying these points and creating an even louder drumbeat to advance a holistic and equitable approach to change rather than a regressive one. And for that alone, it should be applauded and elevated. But additionally is the fact that now it being translated and codified in Spanish, it serves to underscore, democratize this message, some of which David alluded to, which is making it increasingly accessible and resonant to not only educators and leaders, but also to community members or others whose efforts are instrumental in supporting and agitating for change. And so with this, it really holds this potential to enhance the reach of the work beyond traditional boundaries, like those found in school walls, for example, or even national borders. And a final point I'll make about the importance of this translated volume, and thinking about it a little more closely in the last few days, is that bear with me through this idiom here, but it doesn't just talk the talk, but this book is also walking the walk, meaning that this book isn't just talking about understanding and building off an individual's cultural or personal funds of knowledge as support for learning and well-being, but by virtue of translating the work into another knowledge or into another language, it's signaling and embodying its commitments to demonstrating how knowledge and wisdom are captured in these more individualized and different, diverse approaches to knowing, speaking, language, all of the above. So it's that practice of translation or tapping into cultural assets. It's not just about meeting people where they are and tapping into folks' mental models, which of course are worthy practices and very important, but it's also about signaling and seeking out ways for enhanced and nuanced meanings that emerge in Spanish translation and other funds of knowledge to enrich what we all collectively know about how to support students. I'll stop there, David.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Laurel. Let me ask you one question that I have based on what you just said. Because I want to tell you that I think you're right about walking the talk and walking the walk. And I want to tell you that part of what happens for me in this walk, in the walk, is in the process of QAing the translation and in reading your pieces as well. It has also deepened my understanding. It has made more profound my understanding of things that I didn't have before. And I'm wondering from within your work, which is, and I think the playbook work and the examples, that coactive process that I also write about, what we do with others, where it is as educators reach out, if they're really letting themselves be engaged by, and not just engaging, and that's purposely webbed, woven through the text. That's a good word, David. That they transform themselves is a point that Sean Ginwright has made recently. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's absolutely right. And in hearing you just describe that, it made me, it went immediately to the kind of educative process itself. And what does it mean for folks to kind of stretch their thinking, engage ideas in a new way, even similar ideas, coming at it in a new way, having it interpreted through a different lens or language in this instance, and how that is growing the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist by training, but I do know that's activating different components. And honestly, that's the activity that educators and leaders are seeking for youth in schools, right? And so kind of how do we bring this collection of actors, educators and leaders included, but family members, how do we bring all of these folks to the table, kind of activating their thoughts and bringing that knowledge to bear and that new learning that can then form kind of more of a collective to support the work moving forward. So I think you're absolutely right in that. And now speaking through it that way, I'm realizing that it's kind of modeling the type of learning and whole child design that is being sought out through trying to transform schools in this way. So that's really powerful.
Super. Thank you so much, Laura. So we're now going to return to Angelica, and then we'll go to Ray. So Angelica. You're on.
All right. Thanks, David. Yeah, so just to kind of build on what Laura was saying and add to that. So when I read the book, it really resonated with me, the work that we're doing through the Regional Educational Laboratory Southwest at AIR. We do a lot of work with partners in state education agencies and districts. And one project that we worked on for many years was with the New Mexico Public Education Department, creating resources for their educators of English learners. And we really strive to make equity the center of that work and providing materials that were culturally and linguistically appropriate for the audience and for educators. So we had a lot of the materials available in Spanish. We really focused on also using techniques of continuous improvement and improvement science so that they could test a lot of these practices that we found to be promising practices based on research, but having them take it back and understand like if it works in their context with their students, with their English learners. I think the book also mentions how continuous improvement is useful for looking at data, testing solutions, finding, what works with their students and not just applying it without knowing, is this something that's going to be helpful for my students and their families? So yeah, I thought the book was really resonated with me and was applicable to the work that we're doing. And I can put in the chat, so these 2 resources that we developed are free. You can find them on the Institute for Education Sciences website and the New Mexico Public Education Department's website. And you can try them for yourself if you work with English learners. So thank you, David, for including me. I thought that it was really great.
I'm going to ask you a question before we go on, and then I'll come back with questions for everybody. But beforehand, I want to, and Laura, I'm going to ask you to give a link here. Maybe I attended virtually a wonderful webinar that LPI and Castle, and I forget who else, and the AASA put on a few days ago about the science of learning and development and whole child work. And one of the 2 field presenters was somebody whom I remember meeting when LPI brought me into to speak in New Mexico, who had been at the Los Alamos Foundation. Now she is at the Department of Education. And she was talking about the power of cultural responsive work and things like that. It was really a very powerful resonance of what you're saying. The question I want to ask you, and Angelica, is, I know from conversations I've had with you about the fact that linguistic competency and linguistic equity is an important part of equity. Do you want to talk a little more about that? Because I know you've been thinking about that.
Yes, I think that it is, to be equitable, we also have to provide materials, what we're doing in Spanish, whatever your audience, whoever they are, the language that they're dominant in, just to respect and affirm their linguistic identity and just their ability to be comfortable with the material and to understand it. It's really important that you provide it in their language. There are a lot of educators who are multilingual and are fluent in both languages, but they might be more comfortable reading in Spanish, providing instruction in Spanish. So having the book available to them in Spanish, I think, is just really important. And also knowing that it could be used not just in the US, it can be used in other countries and Spanish-speaking countries. So I think it has a reach to reach a lot of different contexts and people and educators. So I think that it's really powerful.
Thank you, Laura. We'll be back to you. I now want to go to the 3rd person who I had the privilege of inviting in, Racing Didia, from the president of Communities in Schools, which in itself is a really important organization that I have had the good fortune of learning from and watching over many years. And so, Ray.
Well, David, first of all, thank you again. I'm thrilled to be included amongst the voices and really the authorship of getting to be able to place my own voice in the foreword of the book is quite a privilege. So thrilled to be here and really just. Let me just say it in my parents' language. Es un placer estar con este grupo y me da mucho orgullo de ser incluido como una voz en este libro. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and I'm just proud to be included. And I think there's a lot that I could really kind of jump into based on what I had a chance to read through the book and understand that there is so much in the way of what it looks like to work with schools or work inside schools or work alongside the partners inside school that can feel like you have thought through a good idea and you feel like there is a strategy that is the most effective in one community. The lens by which I come to this work, because at Communities in Schools, we work in about 110 communities, is that every community has a little bit of distinction, and they will remind you that there are distinctions about their communities if you are working with them and you want to be successful in their schools or in their communities or with nonprofits that are working outside those communities. And I think what is just incredibly important for us at Communities of Schools as a national nonprofit is just the idea of what scales. And the problem with the first problem a lot of people make when they think about what scales is that they try to replicate without changing or adjusting or customizing to local contexts and local communities. And I think what this book really allows many folks to do, especially those who are in positions of leadership to work inside schools, is really just to recognize the different levels of context that exist when you're working with families, when you're working with community partners, the different layers of governments. I know the chapter in the book really gets into how to fund the work of evidence-based student supports and how to really apply those learnings in real context. And I think, smart people learn from their mistakes, but smarter people learn from other people's mistakes. And I think it's even, the term mistake is not the right one to use here because there are just lessons learned through any experience. And so, David, I think what you and the authors have done here is really capture a lot of those experiences that many of us who, as Laura said, work inside systems that have ingrained into those systems resistance to change, resistance that has been built on decades of how to really ingrain systems of barriers or obstruction, especially for our students who are living in poverty or students of color. I think it's important for all of us to really understand how important it is to apply different lenses to different communities, especially if we're thinking about strategies that we think can have a deep and large impact. Again, what scales is not necessarily what is standard or replicable in every community to look the same. And I think it was important that this book really captures a lot of the lessons, not just through the research and through the evidence base, but through real experiences that you all pull through in anecdotes. And so grateful that I get to be part of lending a voice, especially as somebody who has overseen a lot of the work happening in so many different communities. And just two communities that I think I'd like to highlight because I think it's relevant is the experience I had, or that we had as we were growing into the community of Uvalde in Texas. Uvalde is a rural community. It's also a very strong Spanish-speaking community. And as Laura described, there is not just the safety and belonging of the physical aspects of school, of which that community was certainly feeling a year ago after the shooting that occurred, but it really was the post-traumatic events and how you really build a system of support that can be sustained long-term for issues outside of just the sense of fear or trauma around physical safety. And it really is how to look at a comprehensive approach to a community support system inside a school, which is something that we at Communities of Schools and a lot of other practitioners who are working alongside our principals and educators are really trying to figure out, that I think this book helps inform. And the other community is a community that maybe not a lot of folks would recognize, but it's in the outskirts or outskirts of Atlanta, Cross Key Elementary. There's communities just like this elementary school in Cross Key that is welcoming in new Americans that are speaking a different language than English. And a lot of educators who are trying to adapt to their families, the students, and the strategies that might work. And I think in that way, you have educators that are invited into this conversation of what evidence-based looks like. And those are some of the experience I've gotten to see over the last year, but something that I think helps inform this big tent approach that the addition of a Spanish translation brings to the research. So grateful to be part of it.
Let me ask you one question right now, Ray. Thank you for those really rich examples. In work that I have done with a bunch of people, including my life partner, Trina Osher, working with families, I know that one of the ways that educators can benefit is to learn more about individual children and their families and their funds of knowledge when we can hear from families about what they see as the strengths. How important is it to provide a common book and a common language so that it becomes possible for different types of Spanish-speaking parents to share their wisdom coming from their familia? I can't give you the plural, los familia, I guess, with the educators.
Yeah, well, when it comes to really trying to figure out how to partner in a genuine, authentic way with families, you would think that there is 1,000 ways to get this right and only 1 or 2 ways to get this wrong. but there are places where we could trip in what can seem like very easy steps to try to engage communities, whether it's how we invite them in what contexts and what communities, what physical spaces they come to. And in that way, the work is not only hard, but it can become very complicated because there are different ways that we can approach what genuine community input or involvement looks like in the success of a young person. But oftentimes what we try to do is almost the most minimal amount of effort to do this outreach. And I think if you're not considering the way that we transform communities to be with it from the inside out, we can sort of look at this strategy around family and community engagement as being something we do from the outside in to check a box. And the work is much more complicated than that. Folks, especially parents and parents of young people who are giving us their most important asset when they allow us to work with schools, they're going to be very keen to make sure that they feel like you have built a trusting relationship with them. And so the term that will be often used with a lot of our staff who are working with schools and working with parents is, how long will it take for us to truly build a strong enough relationship to build the kind of trust that we need to support these families? If we're going to bring resources to the table, they have to first trust us. And I think that's the important work of getting to that genuine bridge of authentic relationship when we're working with families and parents of our young people.
What a wonderful point. And I should say a wonderful set of points. Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question, then I'm going to ask one more question to your two colleagues. And in this case, in one sense, it will sound like I'm being tone deaf because you've made the case already. But I can tell you that at different points when I've wanted to get people to translate other documents, and I've gone to public authorities, I'm not talking about my AIR colleagues or anybody right now. They've basically said, why do you need it? Because of the fact that, those people who are Spanish speaking educators can read in English. Why do you need that? Okay. And I can actually think of a horror story a long time ago where someone was saying to me, and if they can't understand it in English, it doesn't matter anyway. So I know that that's not how you feel. I've heard you, but would you, in your voice and experience, why is it important to make this available in Spanish, not just in English, even for your Latinx staff?
Yeah, absolutely. And with a lot of staff who are working all across the country, I know this from personal experience. I think we all know this just in general, that there's no language, no country or group of people that have a monopoly on good ideas. And I think what the importance of translating this work into Spanish that's already done such a great job of compiling lessons learned is that you create a bigger tent around this effort, that if you have been in the work of systems change inside schools, you know how hard it is, and you know how humbling it can be to try to approach a new school, a new community, or a principal who is leading a school with a predominance of students who are struggling on a very specific issue, whether that is, attendance or behavior or homelessness or food insecurity, that you think you might have a solution to it. And what I think this work does is just essentially open up the voices and the people who are implementing these strategies so we can learn as quickly as we can what strategies are working. Again, if you have been in this work long enough, it humbles us all. And we're all constantly working towards a better tomorrow, more equitable schools inside our public education system. And it can be incredibly tough. And I think what the book is doing is really bringing all those pieces together. And frankly, the experience of being on this call, being invited to be part of the forward, that there's some real genuine effort to try to get this right. And you cannot be inclusive if you don't invite people in. And I think what this is at least allowing us to do is bring more minds into how we outline strategies for families, how we outline strategies for those communities that for a long time have been held back. It's certainly helpful to our practitioners who are working inside schools, who come to this work with multi-lenses of experiences and languages. And in that way, I think it just really advances the research in a space, again, that is so incredibly difficult on its easiest day. And I think the more voices, the more people in that tent, the better.
Thank you very much, Ray. Angelica, let me ask you one other question that really builds on the question I asked Ray. So you do, one of the things we do at AIR, and one of the things that your practice has been, involves professional development. How does having a common set of texts now that are available in English and Spanish with even the same pagination help you?
It helps a lot. I mean, it helps show people that we respect their language and we affirm their identity and understanding that they know the nuances of the language and they're comfortable speaking in that language and learning and reading in that language. So I think it's really useful. I know so many, practices in professional development, it's geared towards English, and English is the dominant language, but I think we need to be inclusive, as Ray said, by inviting people that speak more than one language, who are dominant in other languages, and recognizing just the beautiful language that it is, and how, nuance that you might not get in English, you would get it in Spanish. So I think it is very helpful, and it really helps affirm their identity in being a multilingual educator.
Thank you. And let me end this part of the conversation before we hear from two other people by going to Laura again, who opened this up. And so, Laura, I have a question for you as well. So how will this work help you and your colleagues through things like the playbook to really help all students learn deeply? Because I think one of the things that AIR and LPI agree on is that what we don't want is surface shallow learning. We want deep learning, and it is possible. So how would it help?
Absolutely. In some ways, I'm humble in answering this question when it says help you as a researcher, and a little bit more distant from the work these days, despite having my years in the classroom and working in that capacity. I'm humble in saying how much it will endeavor to do it. But one of the things that I think places like LPI, places like AIR are poised to do is really amplify, disseminate, and elevate the importance of some of these learnings so that it gets in the water, it becomes part of how people enter into the space and how they do the work. And one of the things that comes very clearly through, and it came through in what you were articulating, David, is this: how learning is academic, social, and emotional all simultaneously, right? It's not like social and emotional is not a nice to have feature. It's truly central to and supportive of learning and development. But the other piece of that I think comes through in this work is that attending to those dimensions is a highly individualized endeavor. So understanding that this work will require personalization, relationship building, growing knowledge and connection, and eventually differentiation to support learnings. While that might not be the most direct, clear instruction on how one person can do it, it's a different orientation to teaching and learning that I think helps buffer a mindset of kind of what's the silver bullet, what's the program, what's this that we can use, right? It's an attentive and natural orientation that I think that we can continue to amplify, because I do think educators, leaders, communities, families, all local actors are really sensitive and knowledgeable of this, but sometimes there's a disconnect between kind of systems, policies, and structures and how that gets communicated and implemented. So I think that's a really key component of it here.
I think you got, oh, I'm sorry, keep going.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
I have one more point, and that
Sure.
it builds very much, I think, on what Ray and Angelica were saying, which is about kind of how this work and kind of sharing it in both its original and translated form. Again, I'm going to go back to that word: democratizes the knowledge and really increases the reach. And bear with me through another idiom here. I was thinking very metaphorically today, apparently, but I really do think it goes to this idea that it takes a village. It's expanding what we think of are the kind of funds of knowledge that come into the space and can inform the work we do. But it also, in being translated in Spanish, it also is bringing other folks to the table, right? Understanding that while adults in schools might be able to read English and do it at a high level of the statistic that you shared, it's also suggesting that maybe there's other adults, right? All of us are adults that are, or other individuals and community members that are coming together to support students. And how can we bring and invoke and grow a collective body of knowledge to be able to support all learners? So I think it's actually kind of expanding the web of the folks that can really come together with the knowledge and understanding of what it takes to support students.
I think thank you very much. And all I was going to say is you embodied what I meant by a golden principle, not to be confused with a silver bullet, as Ray did when he reminded us that each community is unique in its own way. It's not enough to say we know how to be culturally competent and we do it in here and we do it the same way elsewhere. We always have to be humble in the to invoke a word that we all use and understand the fact that we need to keep on learning and learning from that rich group of people whom we can learn from. All right, so let me do a transition here. In and around 2000, we had a great center, and I wanted to have in each of the lead people someone who was not a one-trick pony. She's heard this so many different times. And the person in the country who I thought was the best educator, I just found it through a research project who had done wonderful work, is the person I'm now going to introduce, who is a editor with me in this book, and a colleague at AIR for many years, but had been in the field before as a wonderful educator, Sandy Williamson. Sandy, I'd love your thoughts.
Thank you, David. I've enjoyed so much listening to all the panelists this afternoon. So first of all, what a privilege it was for 38 authors who contributed to the original book to have the opportunity to be in hundreds of communities and to do this work. And I think listening to all of you speak, the only points I wanted to add at the near the end of this today is the respect and admiration that the 38 of us who contributed have for the thousands of stakeholders in each of those communities. As I read through chapters now, as I turn to one and want to look something up, I read some of it again and I hear the voices and I remember the stories that were told in those rooms as we met with them and we did this work. And I just really want to honor that, because if we did not have those opportunities and people did not share with us their struggles, their victories, their successes, then this book would not have had, I think, the rich practical content that it has, that has been shared with the field. There's a few points I wanted to make that I don't think have been mentioned. One is the importance of students themselves, and bringing them to the table, giving them a chapter for a study, and then letting them report out on what they read and what they heard and what they think it means for the work that the adults who shape the environment need to maybe pay attention to. The second is, I haven't heard prep programs for school personnel mentioned. So teacher training, school psychologist training, social work training, all of those pre-service programs, this is going to be a critical resource, and I'm just thrilled that it's now going to be accessible to so many more. The last point I guess I would make is, we talk a lot about culture, and we talk about equity, and we talk about access. And as we look at each of the distinct kind of populations of focus that we may be referencing, we also need to remember that each school and each system has its own culture. And that many times we need to step back and we need to first listen and learn what the culture of that environment is itself, absent of, or the combination of all the people that help to make it up. And I think the book did justice to that. I hope it did. And we're just so excited. I want to say deep gratitude to Harvard Education Press and to the Learning First Alliance for their role and being the ones that can actually get this, or got this out to the field, and can get this out to the field in a much broader way. So thanks for the opportunity today, David, and to everyone there at Learning First Alliance. And I pass it back to you.
Thank you. And now, actually, you just heard from Sandy about the importance of our original publisher, the Harvard Education Press. And what I wanted to say is that both we chose to do this book with Harvard Ed Press because of the fact that they embody a commitment to evidence on the one hand, but to be making things available to practitioners in another. And one of the reasons why I've been happy that we made that choice is because I continued to look and read the other books that are produced by Harvard ed press around it, often by people whom I work with as well, but that really embodies some of the same messages. I think that there is no one set of answers. There are a consistent body of answers. And I do think that this book does talk about how do you put those pieces together. But I think that I want us to hear from the press and also express my gratitude to their willingness to take this venture in what should be normative in our country, but is really, unfortunately, way too infrequent. So let me introduce, I had your name down, great, and now I lost it for a second. Okay.
Jessica Fiorillo. I'm
Thank you,
at the
before I got it
Harvard-
back. Okay,
Of
thank you.
course, no, that's fine. I thought I could provide maybe a little bit of history here and maybe a little glimpse into the future. Harvard Education Press published the English language version of Creating Safe, Equitable, and Engaging Schools in 2018. And it quickly became a really critical resource for understanding evidence-based practices. And everyone here on this webinar today has spoken about the significance and the importance of evidence-based practices. And that's because these practices help us make broad but very strategic decisions based on real data that impact the learning, the growth, and the development of real students in the classroom. Because of this approach of this text, it really has had a significant impact on the field of education. And we are truly thrilled that this Spanish language edition can expand the access to this really important work to such a significant segment of the population. As I think David said at the beginning, that the US is the 4th largest population of Spanish speakers. Was that right? Did I get that statistic right? I think that was right.
Correct.
At Harvard Education Press, our overall mission is to provide practitioners and policymakers with the knowledge and the tools and the information they need to understand and address the educational issues that are facing our society. And there's no shortage of them, right? Our whole publishing program really focuses on research-based projects and how they tackle educational issues, with a really strong emphasis on communicating that research to practitioners so that they can use it, put it into practice in their schools, in their classes. And we certainly can't think of a better way to broaden the reach of what we do than offering Spanish language editions like this one. And we are deeply grateful to the author team, to the American Institutes for Research, and to the Learning First Alliance for making the Spanish language edition available. And I really loved Ray's analogy of building a bigger tent. So we're glad to be part of building a bigger tent and hope to work with you all in the future to build even bigger tents. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm now going to start a closing, and then I'm going to pass it back to Angelica so that we can also end in Spanish. There have been some common themes here that have been wonderful, and I've learned a lot. I want to share with you some stories that I thought about before, but they're really resonant with these themes. And I'm going to locate each one with you. So I want to take you first to a meeting that took place just north of Dallas, Texas. I was meeting with about 15 activist Mexican-American students who were part of an organization working for change. And I asked them, what would they tell teachers to do to make the classroom safer and to produce learning? And I want to tell you what they said. They said 2 things: get to know us, get to know our names, learn how to pronounce them. So I'm sorry when I forgot you for a second, Jessica. And at the same time, pronounce our names right. And that I understood, because that's a real challenge. And I think it's hugely important for people to hear their name and not be othered, or not just be a you. But the second thing they said, I think, is really important And it relates to a point that Laura brought up earlier. And they said, understand what embarrasses me and don't do it. And for a teacher to know that, they have to start knowing the student. And schools are places of public humiliation. We know that. They're emotionally high stakes. And it is so important for adults to be able to create the spaces where people can feel emotionally safe, but they can't have perfect Geiger counters. They really need to hear. They need to have relationships so that I can tell Laura what is necessary for me to feel safe and what is not necessary to me to feel safe. So that's story number one, and it's about communication. It's also about the fact that while people don't want to be banged against the wall, while people certainly don't want to be watching another person go down, to guns in our society, people also don't want to be humiliated. They don't want to be embarrassed. And what we know from the neuroscience that connects back to learning as well as to health and well-being is that when you're under any sort of threat, that tends to work against your ability to learn, work against your ability to do the things we want schools to do, which is why those people say, just knuckle down and focus on the learning and let's get back and we got to make up for all that learning loss and let's not attend to all those frills, aren't getting it. Because if we're not attending to those other issues that are part of the learning process, we're not going to have the learning take place. Okay, story number two. I had the good fortune in the 1980s of being dean of a school of human services that was English speaking, though we had many Latinx students. But we also had been asked by a bunch of educators in Puerto Rico who were doing a program in community economic development that was part of the school of human services we had, to be the host institution for them while they were going for accreditation. And in order to do that, as a dean, I really had to play a responsible role, and I had the good fortune of going to Puerto Rico about 5 times a year to really meet with my colleagues who were on the faculty there, who were all bilingual, and they could really support monolingual David. I can read a little Spanish, but I can't speak it. So they were always translating for me. And one time we're walking down the streets in San Juan, and one of them says to me, David, can we speak the ease? We want to speak our own language, not to exclude you, but just because it's going to be easier. And I think that point that Angelica made is really important. And I'm again going to connect it to the work that I and others have been doing in the science of learning and development. We only have so much bandwidth. And if we're using our cognitive space to end up trying to translate something into a second language, or we're really trying to figure out what it means, it's going to be much harder to figure out what it means. It doesn't mean that you don't want to dig in, but even those of us who believe that learning is constructivist know that you need to facilitate the constructivism so that people can really not just have to be on the surface, but can really deeply work. Okay, and then the third word, and I had to check it out because I had once participated in around 1990 in a wonderful 2-week workshop of community organizers and cultural workers. And one of my colleagues, who was a popular educator who had worked in Nicaragua, used the word that turns out to be a Spanish word. It is profoundizing. And there's a Spanish word for it, just like there are German words for it, even though there's not in English, about deepening your understanding. And I think, as Laura, said before, but it could have been Angelica, when we do the type of enterprise and we're bringing other people in, let me just admit one more person, when we're bringing them into the discussion, we are creating the possibility to profoundize for ourselves. It's not just from systems knowledge that we get more information. It may mean that we can get, as Ray was suggesting to us, that information in a much deeper manner. And I think that's hugely important, because ultimately what we also need to be able to do is to understand and honor people's lived experience, including the lived pain that contributes to what they're bringing to where we are today, so that we can work together to heal for a much better tomorrow for our kids, for our families, and for our communities, and for our country. And with this, and with my gratitude to all of you, if you've hung with this or you came in later and are seeing this, and to the Learning First Alliance, I want to pass it on to Angelica, who can conclude our session today.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all. Something's going on with my camera, but I just want to close out in Spanish. Gracias por asistir hoy a este taller. Estamos muy agradecidos por su presencia y su voz de todos. Gracias por ser parte de esto y esperamos que lean el libro y el libro sea útil para ustedes que trabajan con niños y con comunidades en español. Esperamos que sí sea útil y bueno, gracias a todos y buenas tardes.
Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today. You'll be able to find the complete text on the Learning First Alliance website. That's learningfirstalliance.org, and also the American Institute for Research website. And we're making this freely available, and we want it to be widely shared, widely used, and also widely marked up to make it yours. David and the panel, thank you for an enlightening, engaging, and profoundly important session.